Hello, and welcome to this important panel discussion on reducing the environmental impacts of farming. My name is Sardar, and I work with the Policy and Insights team at The Economist Impact. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. Here at The Economist Impact, we have just released one of our flagship projects on food, the Global Food Security Index, supported by Corteva AgriScience, that is now in its 11th year. The Global Food Security Index, or GFSI for short, measures the enabling environment of food security across 113 countries. The data shows worrying trends in our global food environment. After hitting its peak in 2019, global food security scores have since declined. Political, economic, and environmental developments in 2022 have put extreme pressure on global food security. Food prices remain volatile, and prices of critical agricultural inputs like fertilizers and fuel remain high. These socio-economic shocks have resulted in worsening hunger and concerns of a global crisis. How can agriculture be managed sustainably to increase yield while reducing its climate impact? How can farms be made resilient to increasingly unpredictable and ferocious weather? How to feed 10 billion people by 2050 without devouring the planet? To discuss these questions and more, we have three distinguished guests with us today. Our first guest is Chandran Nair. Chandran is founder and chief executive officer of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, or GIFT for short, an independent think tank based in Asia. He is also the founder of the Other 100, a non-profit global initiative presenting a counterpoint to media consensus on some of our today's most important issues. Chandran is a member of the World Economic Forum. Our second guest is Dirk Voste. Dirk is Senior Vice President for Global Product Safety and Registration in BASF's Agricultural Solutions Division. He was previously Vice President of the company's Corporate Development Division, responsible for its global sustainability strategy. Dirk has worked on global marketing for seed treatment, seed research, and global sustainability and product safety. Our third guest is Rama Kukutai. Rama is Chief Executive Officer of Plenty and co-founder of Finister Ventures, a venture firm dedicated to agri-food investment. Rama has been associated with the agribusiness sector for more than 20 years. He previously served as founder and executive chairperson of PKW Farms, developing and operating sustainable grass-based dairy farming and aquaculture across Asia and Australia. I welcome you all to this session. Let's start with Dirk. Dirk, you say farming is the biggest job on earth. Can you please explain what you mean by that? And where do you see the role of businesses like yours in reducing farming's impact on our environment?
Yeah, certainly. I think farmer is one of the biggest jobs on earth. I think there are several others which I think currently in these difficult times should be mentioned. But farmers do the job. At the end of the day, farmers produce on their land affordable and healthy food for all of us today and certainly tomorrow. But they need choices to combat certain uncertainties, certain 5 C's. So let me give you a short idea what the 5 C's are. And certainly climate change is one of them. You see that 20% of the greenhouse gases are produced through agriculture. So agriculture has an enormous, potential not only to reduce the impact, but also naturally sequester carbon. But on the other hand, and we'll talk about this most likely later in the session, is how can we farm resilient? How can we, combat weather patterns irregularly, heats and droughts on one side, too much flooding and water on the other side? I think this will be really key, and farmers are in the center of really doing it. The second C is COVID. And due to COVID, we had shortage in labor. A lot of fields, when you look at vegetable farmers, they even couldn't harvest their fields because they didn't have labor to do that. So they even started to seed and plant seeds. We saw that supply chains, food supply chains, and also machinery supply chains were disrupted and really left more people on this planet hungry. And the third one is conflict. The war and aggression in Ukraine, I think, will left us and will leave us also now in the future with more people to be hungry. We saw the material, the wheat, not being, distributed to Africa and other countries of the global south for a certain period of time. But what we experience and will see is less crops will be harvested this fall. We will see this not only in Ukraine, but also in Russia, because important machineries are under the embargo, and most likely we will see that yield will plummet and the inventories, which are currently around 100 to 120 days on the crop, will even further decrease. The next one is, and we all experience these days, are costs. Inflation is high. We just saw in Germany today, it's 10% inflation. I think we never had this since the 50s. So we're seeing that energy prices, food prices are up, and farmers who need to put fertilizer on their fields to grow and harvest the crop at the end of the day pay a fortune, have to pay a fortune, because there is no choice. There is a time to fertilize, and you need to do it at that point in time and buy fertilizer, if at all you can acquire it. And the last C is cities. And cities stands for a proxy of having less agricultural area, agricultural land available. What we see is, due to the growth of cities, to the demand of mobility and putting more land under concrete, also seeing that less and less land is available for agriculture, and we see roughly 12 million hectares per year being not available for agricultural land. This is roughly, and if you would like to take this, it is roughly 30 soccer fields a second, which goes away, which means at the end of the day, on less land, with more people on the planet, there needs to be more people to be fed from less hectares. And if you just assume we're expecting 3 more billion people on this planet, and if we take the calculation that roughly 60-70% of them will live in cities, which means 2 billion more people live in cities, and this will be 200 cities of the size of Mexico City. And this is massive, also in terms of taking away agricultural land, the logistics around that, and certainly feed them. So the 5 C's of uncertainty. And those uncertainties can only be managed and matched by farmers if they have choices. Choices in terms of technology, available technology, which can be used, which can be implemented. And it's not about conventional integrated pest management, organic or vertical farming. It's about the right solution at the right time to really feed the people of this planet today and tomorrow. And it also means with all the technologies, we not only have to combat these uncertainties, but we also have to produce with less and less environmental footprint. And we'll talk about this, of course, in the next case, but it's about the right technologies at the right time without any ideological background. And our vision is not only to produce more, but produce more and better, what we call the better yield.
Thank you, Dirk. Indeed, these choices for farmers, be it technology solutions or other solutions, are really critical. Rama, I want to bring you into the discussion. You have been working extensively on indoor farming as one potential solution. How does indoor farming help solve for food security, environmental sustainability, and also economic scaling of these new food systems, please?
Sada, to be clear, today less than 1% of our food is produced indoors. So to talk about food security using indoor might seem, frankly, a little optimistic or even ludicrous, but it's not. And I'll tell you why. If you think about, every farmer's simple agronomy formula, sort of referencing some of the points that Dirk was making here, the formula is GEM, right? Genetics, environment, management. And really, since the beginning of time in agriculture, we've had to contend with how to manage around the environment, whether it's developing seeds and crops that are more drought tolerant, more salt tolerant, capable of dealing with pests in the environment, whether it's using management techniques like irrigation, for example, which I want to come back to, given we talked about emissions, but I think actually a much more immediate concern from an environmental standpoint is water, either not enough of it or too much of it. But the environment has been effectively a factor that has not been in the calculation really, other than as a highly variable factor to consider in our farming decisions. And we're only ever one fire season or hailstorm away from pretty critical crop loss. And of course, we all know the environment is getting less predictable, even in countries like my homeland of New Zealand, which has generally been able to rely on temperate climate conditions and plentiful water supply. And obviously, you've all seen if you haven't visited the picture postcards of the green rolling hills. Well, guess what? We now have drought conditions. We now have rivers tapping out. We now have too much water in winter. So environment is a factor that is going to be a continued challenging constant in this. And indoor farming, of course, offers the promise of being able to take the environment out of the equation. And here at Plenty, what we've been focused on is building a new platform technology to enable us to grow resiliently at scale using effectively 1/300th of the land. So our current production numbers are about 300 to 1 versus, say, greenhouses at, say, 15 or 20 to 1. And why is this important? Well, we need to figure out ways in which we can scale technology in a way that will give us resilient food supply that is complementary to all the fantastic work being done by outdoor farmers, which me and my family and myself come from a farming background. But we know that environmental control offers enormous opportunity for us, not only in terms of just production primarily, which is what we're doing. Today, we grow leafy greens. We're working on strawberries. We're working on tomatoes. So high-value, perishable crops. But indoor technologies are also advancing in a way to give us tools to help the outdoor farmer, for example, in breeding, speeding up breeding cycles, developing new crop alternatives, coming up with new strategies for managing environment, which are really, if you like, leveraging the technology that's gone and technology investments gone into the space. As you noted, I've also been a venture investor in this space actually for more than 15 years, more than 40 companies, spanning a lot of the areas that Dirk is involved in outdoor farming. But what I have to say I'm very encouraged by is that over the last decade, more than 130 billion in venture dollars has gone into ag and food companies at about the ratio of 2 to 1 food to ag. In the last 5 years, 12 billion has gone into technologies related to indoor. So vertical farming, which is what Plenty does, but also technologies like fermentation and cultivation, or so-called lab-grown products, including meat. And they offer collectively a sort of snapshot into the future of how we might manage many of the resource challenges that, frankly, outdoor farming is stuck with. So in our case, we use 5% or less of the water that the field uses. We produce right next door to the mega cities that Dirk has noted. Our first commercial farm is actually here in Los Angeles, in California. So we were in a position where we can change also the logistics and supply chain challenges, as well as the actual emissions related to transport, overcome issues related to trade access by being essentially domestic producers. And also, I think importantly, what is farming? As Dirk said, it's one of the biggest employers, one of the biggest legacies in the world. But farming actually, through technology, is changing. And it's actually creating new opportunities for communities, new opportunities for diverse communities to come into the food world and actually be participants in food and egg production from a technology standpoint. I think this is actually a really optimistic and exciting thing for us.
Thank you, Ram. Indeed, all these things that you mentioned, technology growing in this area and all those forecasts for the future, those are brilliant. I just want to bring in Chandran at this point. Chandran, you have written in an article for the WEF that the estimates of food needed to feed a global population of 10 billion people, that needs to be questioned. You have argued that it is based on some wrong assumptions of food overconsumption, perhaps. Can you explain why that will be catastrophic and why we need to frame the question of feeding the world through a very different lens?
Thank you, Sardar, for having me. Before I just answer that question, let me say that the framing of the discussion today here is also rather interesting. On one hand, we talk about the reducing of the environmental impacts of farming, and then we go on to talk about feeding people. I mean, these are quite different issues. And at the same time, we conflate this with biodiversity loss and how we can regenerate biodiversity, etc. So there's a lot to unpack here. I suspect we don't have the time, but I just wanted to say these are very complex, separate but interrelated issues. So before I answer your question, one statistic that people might be interested in is that, something like 85% of the world's 600 million farms are smallholdings. Most of these are in poor countries. Most of these are in poor countries. So when we talk about farming, we are talking about the very fabric of the culture, traditions of many of these countries. It's not just an industry; they're employing people. It's very, very different. So I just want to make that point. The point I made in my piece, I think it was in response to a World Resources Institute report a few years ago, saying that we would need to produce 50% more food in the next 30 years or something to feed the world. And I challenge that because much of that is based on current day food production practices, business models, and consumption patterns in the West. And the danger with this is then equating it with and normalizing that sort of consumption patterns, production practices, business models as what the world needs. But in 2050, we cannot be eating and consuming the way those of us who are privileged to overconsume and waste. And all of us know that the entire food system is based on wastage. And we cannot do that. So let me just try and put that in perspective, for instance, right? So if the world's population is going, if we need 50% more food, is what the data suggests, and my point is that I think this is based on we need to follow Western consumption models, business models, and consumption and practices. If we have to produce 50, well, just look at the data. But the world's population is only going to increase by about 25%. Yet at the same time, we know that food wastage, at the gate is something like around the world is 40%. Food plate waste is about 25%. Wastage at the production stage is pretty high. So you just look at those numbers and you say, well, these numbers that we need 50% more food production is saying we don't need to change anything else about the way we do things. I'm arguing we fundamentally need to change the way the current food system operates, which is based on promoting relentless consumption, which is why we have an obesity explosion across the world. But no one's talking about that. They just talk about we need to grow more food. I'm arguing that we need to think about how do we actually encourage less consumption, which is, of course, anathema to the sort of way we think about economics. Then how do we price things? And let's also be very clear. I mean, Dirk did say, we want to produce healthy food. But I come from a science background. The data will tell you more and more of the food being consumed by all of us around the world is not healthy. And we also need to understand just equating the food issue with investment is really not getting the big picture. Companies are not going to change the feeding the world issue, nor are they going to change how we essentially reduce the ecological footprint, the expansion of human agriculture because of human population growth. This is going to be policy. And that is going to be essentially the role of the state. So I know you're going to talk about this later, but I am of the view that we need to redefine how do we look at, in particularly the large developing countries of the world, how do we look at the agricultural sector, not as an industry sector, but as part of the essential, the fabric and the web of life in these countries. If you go to India, China, parts of China, Cambodia, parts of Africa, you will see what I mean. So we need to rethink that. Then how do we think about these people as not simply as employees of companies? Many of these people are self-employed. And so how do you price them? And to the point of urbanization, how does urbanization essentially not become a sponge on the hinterland, which is disenfranchises people from the land because we don't pay the right price for food? And many policies in countries are geared towards encouraging overconsumption, underpricing it to keep urban populations happy while disenfranchising rural populations. There's a lot of policy issues here to be discussed. My main point is we need to completely look at what do we mean by we need to grow 50% more food, given that we all know wastage is built into the economic model of the food industry today.
So thank you, Chandran. Thank you, Chandran. I do want to go back to then Dirk and Arama to sort of respond to that in terms of what role do you see businesses like yours particularly addressing that concern of food wastage, or more broadly these other costs that Chandran mentioned, where food is about these cultures, these societies, and their livelihoods. How would you think businesses should operate in such an environment? Or perhaps Dirk, you can go first.
Yeah, sure, I can. First of all, Chandra, I think you're touching a lot of things, a lot of points, which in itself are already giant topics, not only to discuss, but I think to bring them together, because as you also said, they're interlinked. And if you're putting onto one string, you will see consequences on the other end. And the first thing I think I buy into your concept of saying we need a political framework which allows this topic. The second one is we need cross-border, cross-value chain, strong cooperation to make sure what kind of topic we are talking about. And the third one is we need technologies, and not only technologies, as you said, for Western agricultural farming practices, but also technologies for the global south and smallholder farmers, which in principle, with certain technologies, you can double the yield and certainly, let's say, bring them into more prosperity. And on the fourth end, I would say we talked quite a lot, but I think now it's really time for action. We need to do something. Because if you just look at climate change and you see in your assumption that there is a yield stability and it may grow in less land, we also have to put into the equation here. Arama made a point of saying if you control environmental conditions, you at least have yield stability. If we believe that climate change is really devastating for yield and yield stability, be it too much water during seeding or harvesting or even droughts, we would see a decline on average in yields. And I think this will make the topic even more dramatic. And then you have two topics. One is yield loss on the acre until the gate, and then waste, which to a certain degree is roughly 30 to 40%, which we need to combat. So where can industry step in? We, from our end, from the input industry, can deliver these choices, as I said, to provide technologies for the breadth of farming, to have the right technologies locally adapted at the right time. And this can be seed. This can be fertilizer. This can be digitalization. This can be crop protection products. This can be biologicals. You name it. They need to be local. They need to be adapted, and they need to be available and pragmatically used for farmers. Otherwise, those choices are just a leaflet or an internet page and not be used in farming. I think this is where business plays a role. Where we can also play a role is forming these collaborations strongly across the value chain for certain topics, be it on consumer, let's say, education, on value chain demands, on other topics. For example, if you look at our vegetable breeding program, we are now starting to breed smaller size of melons, smaller size of crops, in order to combat, in principle, food waste. We know if there's a large melon, maybe 20-30% would be wasted. If there's only 1 kg melon, this melon would be eaten in the same day. And Arama, you most likely will strongly comment on food waste based on leafy crops produced in controlled environments, because food waste is to a certain degree controlled because you produce on demand. So what I'm saying is a lot of technologies can be used and should be deployed based on the really local needs. But to make this point once more, it's time to act now, because what we're seeing is year by year climate change, and particularly climate change as a driver for yield stability and yield productivity, is really taking speed.
Thank you, Dirk. Can't agree more to acting now. Arama, your take on Chandran's point.
Well, look. Firstly, I think Dirk touched on part of it there around food waste. This is absolutely agree with Chandran. This is a huge issue, but it's not just an issue of farming; it's an issue of infrastructure. For example, perishable crops like those that we work on need to be kept within cool chain. Even China only has about 15% cool chain coverage compared to the US with 85%. So that might seem like a big mountain to climb in terms of food waste. Well, actually, if you can put food production right next to cities, which is essentially what we're doing with our technology, it actually helps collapse that supply chain in a way that means that there's much less waste, or shrink, as retailers like to call it, between harvesting today and being on shelf tomorrow. You can't even do that in California outdoors. It's 3 days from Salinas through a pack house into a Safeways or a Walmart or a Whole Foods. So almost instantaneous delivery is actually quite a new completely new concept for food and agricultural production. Also, the fresher food is, the more likely it is to actually be used at home. How much produce have folks in the audience here thrown out of their refrigerators? In addition to the plate waste, Chandra referred, just actual waste through expiry. Because we don't just eat for calories, we also eat for pleasure. It's inherent in our cultures. So, where's the place of crops like cacao, coffee beans, avocados, wine grapes? So it's not just large acre cereal crops or indeed grains and oilseeds. It's also a much more vibrant food system that we have to contend with. Thank God. Actually, what would life be like without some of these fantastic foods to eat? So, when I think about it, though, just in terms of other Chandran's other comment, perhaps we have a slight, maybe just a reinterpretational difference here, is that I think it is important that the private sector and policy collaborate here. Indeed, new technologies tend to get invented and commercialized through the private sector, and then they're needed on a broad basis. And often the adoption of those technologies can't happen without the appropriate support from policymakers. Indeed, if we just take, for example, irrigation is an important insurance policy for farmers against variable weather, but it tends only to be available to farmers in countries that have the dollars and infrastructure available to implement those types of technologies. Here in California, we have 9 million irrigated acres, just to put that into context. But we also have, frankly, I'll probably be careful saying this since I'm not a Californian, but I live here, and we have crazy water policy. We frankly now have a scrap going on in the West between states as well as between farmers about seniority of water rights, which is going to likely see more and more acres furloughed because outdoor irrigation is pretty wasteful. Even the most accurate methods like subsurface drip still leave a lot of water going up into the atmosphere through transevaporation, and indoor farming offers a solution to dealing with that, which is not available to the outdoors. I'd also just say, I think that in terms of investment coming into the sector, that there has been actually, if we just look at the number of people we are able to feed today, even with the wasteful conditions that Chandra correctly points out, it's nothing short of an economic and agricultural miracle. And if we go back to the contributions of people like Norman Borlaug, for example, that ability to bring new crop technology has been essential to feeding the population that we already have. So I think we have to look at technology as a continuum that needs to be continued investment from public and private sector. Private sector folks like us are going to look for ways to commercialize and make a return on these technologies. But guess what? It's amazing how these technologies end up finding their ways into all kinds of interesting applications, and unforeseen consequences, sometimes negative, but sometimes very, very good. The genetic revolution, the biotech revolution. Now we're seeing a data science revolution around the ability to use satellites, sensors, IoT. In fact, even in one of the other companies I'm involved with, CropX out of Israel, we're doing a lot of work in Africa and Latin America, because the cost of deploying those technologies over a cheap cell phone has become very, very, and I know BACF has a big investment in this area of digital. How do you provide people, even smallholder farmers, with a cell phone, with the information necessary to manage their crops more effectively? So tech, I guess you can tell I'm a passionate technology advocate here. Technology is going to be incredibly important to the sustainability of all kinds of farming, indoor and outdoor.
Thank you, Arama. Quickly, I want to go back to Chandran and ask, what examples can you give us of countries or businesses where you think that they have looked at it in the right way, with focusing on reducing food wastage or internalizing all these costs of social and even environmental costs as well?
I think there are a few examples. I would phrase that in this way. Actually, the struggle in many countries is resisting the assault of the sort of large-scale industrialization and modernization. That is not to say the points made about bringing in technology, etc. I think it's the reverse. There are many practices, and I'm sure Arama and Dirk know about these, that are actually under attack. Very good sustainable practices. I know about practices in Cambodia and sustainable rice farming, Indonesia, the Kebun system, all of those, Japan, etc. So can I respond to a couple of things that were mentioned, which I think also reflect the point you were making. On the infrastructure side, the point was made. But in the developing world, many of the countries and the governments have neglected to invest in the farming sector, because we thought modernization was get everybody off the farm, get them to do work for a tech company. And I jokingly often say, we need irrigation, water supply system, sanitation before we need more fiber optics and satellites in many parts of the world. Just tongue in cheek. But we don't invest in these things. We went the other way. So that was the false belief that these things could happen. To the point about creating control environments that was referred to, I agree with them. But these are far too expensive to scale up in countries like India, Indonesia, etc. So you're going to have to live with the adaptation to extreme weather and other things that we don't talk about as well, which are all the other existential threats that are taking place. As far as tech is concerned, I come from an engineering background, so I can't be anti-tech. But I do worry about us always referring to tech and digital. Actually, technology is a toilet too. And assuming that that's the panacea for everything. First, you have to use the technology to solve a problem. You have to identify the scale of the
Chandran, sorry,
problem.
if you can quickly wrap up your argument, we are running out of time.
Sure. So all I wanted to say is, where I see which countries do this, I think the pandemic has forced many countries to look at self-sufficiency. And my advice to governments is, firstly, grow the staples yourself. In that way, deglobalize the food supply chain, get self-sufficient in your staples, and then you can do that. The challenge is actually the globalization of the food supply chain, which has taken away sovereignty from the way people essentially grow their foods locally. And there are not many examples, because that has essentially been eroding over the last 2 or 3 decades. We have to recapture that.
Thank you, Chandran. Thank you. We are out of time. We'll leave it at that. Thank you, everyone. Chandran Nair, Dirk Poste, Arama Kukutai, thank you so much for your time and for being here with us today. As we look ahead, we can obviously expect more and frequent severe shocks from the environment that we can be better prepared for. Thank you so much once again, all of you, for tuning in. Stay tuned for our next segment, and goodbye.